The Doors spent 8 times more on this album than on their debut, and it became considered one of their weakest attempts in music.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
Today we are talking about The Soft Parade, the 4th studio album by legendary American rock band The Doors, a record that many critics and fans once called their worst release. But times changed and more listeners began to rediscover the album. Personally, I think The Soft Parade is one of The Doors' most fascinating records. So why did it receive so much hate? Let's break it down. You're watching the Lesser Buro YouTube channel. Here I tell stories about post-punk, electronic music, hip-hop, and dive into deep socio-political and cultural research. And now back to 1968. On December 14th that year, The Doors performed at the Los Angeles Forum. A Chinese musician opened the show, and the audience was eager to see their beloved band. By that point, The Doors already had 3 brilliant albums behind them, and Jim Morrison had transformed from a shy young man who once sang with his back turned to the audience into a full-blown rock star, despite originally dreaming of becoming a famous film director. At some point, someone threw something burning onto the stage. It seriously annoyed Morrison, and he responded by simply standing still while singing, refusing to perform the wild antics the audience had come to expect from him. That same month, the first single from their upcoming album was released, Touch Me.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe.
The song featured string arrangements and a real orchestra. Keyboardist Raymond Zarek and drummer John Densmore wanted the new material to lean toward jazz and classical influences, but Jim Morrison was moving in a completely different direction. A large portion of the lyrics for the new material had been written by guitarist Robbie Krieger, who was responsible for roughly half of the band's songs at the time. Morrison didn't want to be associated with Touch Me, and for the first time in the band's history, he asked for his name not to appear on the back cover alongside the songwriting credits. On stage, Morrison sometimes mocked the song's lyrics, changing the line to "Suck Me." He also insisted on removing the phrase "hit me", partly because he genuinely didn't want some overexcited fan taking the lyrics literally during a concert. By 1969, Morrison had become a real star. His wild image and aggressive stage performances had turned him into an icon among young audiences. But there was another side to the story. Morrison was struggling with alcoholism and growing increasingly distant from the rest of the band, focusing more and more on writing poetry. He believed he had the situation under control and was convinced that alcohol fueled his creativity. Another major influence on him at the time was the underground performance collective The Living Theatre. One of the defining aspects of their performances was the destruction of the barrier between performers and audience. An idea that shared something in common with epic theater, the movement associated with German playwright Bertolt Brecht. Morrison believed he could break down that wall between artist and audience by doing unpredictable, provocative things on stage. In February, the second single from The Soft Parade was ready, Wishful Sinful. A baroque pop song filled with lush strings and bright guitar melodies, it sounded unlike anything the Doors had done before. The line "Wishful, sinful, wicked you, can't escape the blue," paired with Morrison's dramatic vocal performance and rich arrangement, created the feeling that something completely new was emerging from the Doors. Not another dark psychedelic rock record, but something closer to a grand, sophisticated pop album. But those expectations were almost overshadowed by what happened in March 1969. Influenced by recent The Living Theatre performances, Morrison appeared on stage in Miami. Nobody really knows whether he was too drunk or trying to turn the evening into performance art. He began the show by casually talking to the crowd. The band tried to start playing several times, but Morrison would sing a few lines, stop, and go back to talking. When the musicians attempted to launch into the new song Touch Me, Morrison became visibly irritated. He asked the audience if they wanted to see something and suggested he might show them his genitals. Whether he actually exposed himself remains unclear. Most likely, he simply stuck a finger through the fly of his pants. But that alone was enough to create complete chaos in the venue and trigger legal action. After the concert, the band flew to Jamaica. A few days later, Morrison was charged with inappropriate behavior, indecent exposure, and public drunkenness. As unbelievable as it sounds, the incident even sparked a rally of roughly 30,000 people in Miami. 25 Doors concerts were cancelled. Their songs were banned by numerous radio stations. The FBI issued a warrant for Morrison's arrest, and he was later released on $5,000 bail.
Strangely enough, it was almost perfect publicity for a new album.
Before the upcoming release, Morrison once again lost himself in cinema and literature, as if he were beginning to question whether he really wanted to be a rock musician at all. At one point, he was even considering leaving the band.
Tell all the people that you see.
Tell All the People became the third single from the Soft Parade. Richly arranged, uplifting, and sophisticated, it sounded less like classic Doors rock and roll and more like something from the Walker Brothers or a solo Scott Walker record. The song only reached number 57 on the charts. The band had an enormous budget for the new album, around $80,000. For comparison, their debut album had cost only about $10,000. The difference came largely from the number of additional musicians involved in the sessions, players performing violins, saxophone, mandolin, trombone, and orchestral arrangements that the Doors had never used on such a scale before. Soon after its release on July 18, 1969, the Soft Parade was heavily criticized by both journalists and listeners. The album reached number 6 on the Billboard 200, but failed to connect with audiences in the UK and other European countries. For example, David Woolley from New York's East Village Author argued that the record had been badly messed up by the syrupy arrangements of Paul Rothchild and could be renamed "The Rothchild Strings Play the Doors." It's an interesting criticism to revisit today, especially considering that Paul Rothchild was a prominent American producer. Yes, he brought a strong classical, theatrical, and jazz-influenced atmosphere to the album, but blaming Rothchild alone misses the bigger picture. In reality, he was largely executing the vision that Raymond Zarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore wanted to pursue, and the executives at Elektra Records believed turning the Doors into a more accessible pop-oriented act was a reasonable direction for the band. Jim Morrison, however, wanted none of that.
At the same time, sections of underground press harshly attacked the Soft Parade,
describing it as weak and pretentious. In many ways, the Doors audience simply wanted another break-on-through or backdoor man, but the band's desire to move toward a more sophisticated musical direction had already been visible as early as Strange Days. Meanwhile, Morrison himself seemed increasingly disconnected, lost in alcohol, absorbed by poetry, and drifting away from the creative direction the rest of the band was trying to build. And that was perhaps the band's biggest problem.
But let's take a closer look at the Soft Parade itself. Over the years, this album gradually grew on me and eventually became one of my personal favorites in the Doors catalog.
Tell All the People opens with bright brass arrangements that immediately establish the album's tone. Morrison's vocal performance is strong, melodic, and surprisingly elegant. Combined with the orchestration, it creates this strange atmosphere of luxury, theatricality. Touch Me is easily one of my all-time favorite Doors songs. It's beautiful, powerful, and surprisingly emotional. Morrison's vocal sounds fragile and commanding at the same time, while the string arrangements feel perfectly placed within the song, and that saxophone solo is just great. Shaman's Blues is probably one of the most recognizably Doors-like tracks on the album. A heavy electric blues built around thick keyboards and fuzzy guitar lines, it feels much closer to the band's older material. Many listeners dismiss Do It as filler, but I completely disagree. To me, it sounds almost like a musical prayer, spiritual, hypnotic, and deeply groovy. Easy Ride feels like a natural companion to some of the band's earlier work, especially material from Waiting for the Sun. Wild Child shares certain similarities with Shaman's Blues, another heavy, groove-driven blues track packed with energy. Which makes me wonder why so many critics focused exclusively on the supposed overproduction of the Soft Parade singles, while paying little attention to the much rawer second half of the album. Runnin' Blue carries a strange country flavor that's unusual for a classic Doors record. Maybe that's precisely why it often feels like an outsider within the band's catalog. The same certainly cannot be said about the beautiful Wishful Sinful, an intensely artsy, psychedelic, and surprisingly delicate composition.
You cannot petition the Lord with prayer!
The title track, The Soft Parade, was built around Morrison's poem of the same name. In fact, the Soft Parade was a phrase coined by Jim Morrison to describe the bizarre, parade-like daily gathering of radically different people along Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. At nearly 9 minutes long, the song is really strange. It opens with an almost ceremonial proclamation before shifting into a theatrical section driven by groovy bass line and Morrison's loose, chaotic vocal delivery. At times it feels fragmented, excessive, and completely unpredictable, and maybe that's exactly the point.
In many ways, the Soft Parade sounds like the strangest piece of music the Doors ever recorded. The final result proved disappointing for the band. The album didn't perform as strongly as expected and alienated a significant part of their audience. But the Soft Parade actually went gold in the US.
As Morrison himself admitted in 1970, the project had spiraled out of control and taken an incredibly long time to complete. The recording sessions stretched across 9 months. He had wanted the album to function like a book, a collection of interconnected stories forming a unified whole. And according to Morrison, that was precisely what the Soft Parade lacked. If Waiting for the Sun set a lot of older hippies to questioning their former perception of the Doors as avatars of the avant-garde, then the Soft Parade finished off their interest in the group, wrote Richard Riegel in Cream magazine in 1981. From today's perspective, the Soft Parade feels like a brave attempt by the band to move into new musical territory, an experiment complicated by internal conflicts, artistic disagreements, and growing tension between the musicians. While Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore were interested in pushing the Doors toward baroque pop, jazz textures, and more sophisticated arrangements, Morrison increasingly seemed detached from that vision. He was immersed in literature, overwhelmed by alcohol, and perhaps no longer completely certain that he even wanted to remain a rock musician. Soon after the Soft Parade was released, Elektra Records pushed the Doors to begin work on another album. And maybe this is where the band truly began to fall apart.
So what do you think about the Soft Parade? Do you love this record? Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.